Hey Fish Fam, went and picked up a used tank, and it's really not in great condition, so I figured since I'm redoing it anyways, I might as well document the process. So, here's that. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, and go ahead and hit that thumbs up button. So I got this monstrosity from the middle of nowhere in Texas for basically nothing. It's not in the best condition. Back paint is flaky and old. The top here is fake wood veneer trim. The silicone on the inside looks like it's been redone over old silicone. And the tools that you need to redo a used tank are pretty cheap. You're going to need a scraper. Now this razor blade scraper is about $2.50. I think this one was $3 because it comes with 5 blades, but you probably only need one. So you got $2.50 there. A good caulking gun will run about $15, $25. But you can get a cheap one that'll do the job for $3.50. So total we're at $6 so far. You want some kind of silicone if you're going to be re-siliconing, obviously. A lot of people go with the GE Silicone 1. That seems to be the go-to for most people. I'm going to go ahead and use DAP Clear because it's significantly clearer than the GE Silicone is. And I'm going to be using DAP Black on the back because I'm going to be doing a black background. For the background itself, you have a variety of options. Most people like to use just acrylic craft paint. These are 98 cents a jar. I'm going to be going ahead and trying the Krylon Color Master because I want to redo this top to be black. And this says it works on glass. I've never used it to paint a glass tank before, but I'm going to give it a shot because if it screws up, I can always scrape it off again. It's a good idea to have some gloves. I like to use nitrile gloves. But if you're doing this on a budget, you can grab yourself some vinyl gloves from any dollar store. They'll usually come with about 24 of them in there. So the total cost that you're going to be looking at, bare minimum, for redoing a tank of any size, really, is going to be about $11. My preferred glass scraper is a little bit wider. It just lets me get a little bit more at one time. And you want to make sure before you start on any of this stuff that you are free of dust or grit, because if you get some quartz-based dust or gravel or something caught underneath your razor blade while you're scraping, it's important to remember that quartz is what glass is made of, so anything that's really dusty or a little bit gritty has a high chance of being the same hardness as your glass and ruining the surface. There's a variety of ways that you can remove the silicone in the corners. Usually you're going to want to use a razor scraper. These work pretty well. They don't get a lot of resistance. You can scrape sideways, but the locking mechanisms on these are awful. You end up having to wedge it in place the whole time. Frequently it'll pop out and the razor blade will fall out. You end up spending hours fighting with it when you should just be getting work done. So they're cheap, but they're unpleasant. They have much better plastic ones, but these fall apart. You can see I've had to put on some JB Weld water weld here to hold the seams together, because as soon as the slightest bit of torque goes on this, the plastic seams rip. These run about $4, but you want to make sure that you can find the blades. At my local hardware store, the extra blades that are sold next to these don't go to them. They don't have the blades for these, which means you end up having to throw it away when the blade dulls. The blades that they do have at my hardware store go to one of these scrapers, which is much nicer and very easy to use. It's sturdy enough that you don't really have to spend a lot of time farting around with anything else. Because of the metal edging, just a little bit of pressure forces its way through everything and you can be basically done with the tank in about 5 minutes. If you don't want to spend $12 to $15 on one of these and you want to get a cheaper one, you're going to spend more time doing it. You can make it a lot easier if you've got a utility knife. If you start in a corner and you just cut from an angle, cut from the other angle, and just pull the center piece out, you end up with a much smaller amount of silicone in the long run, so you can get it done very quickly. Again, this is the best way I can think of for the cheap one in order to get it to work well and spend the least of your time and have the least frustration. And then here's a comparison for the better one, just cleaning up the top of the tank here real quick.
It's about a 2-foot section, and each side took me about 15-20 seconds, and then I spent a little bit of extra time cleaning it up with a wire brush because I can't really get in there. So it's a pretty easy process to do this portion of it. Some other things you may run into on older tanks are this edge in here is pre-etched to try to make the silicone stick a little bit better. There's not really anything you can do about that. It's going to make super visible edges, but it is what it is. Secondly, very frequently you will find the bottom sheet here that's been covered by silicone will have some chips and things in it. And this is, you know, because it's large, heavy glass, a lot of times they'll end up with things like that, and they'll try to cover it up with the frames. So down here, you don't see this when the silicone is in. It's largely superficial and on the inside. It doesn't go all the way through. There are a couple spots like this that were just underneath the factory silicone. Sometimes the silicone was put a little bit higher to try to hide it because these really large sheets are very expensive. If you go to a glass store and you try to get an 84 by 24 inch sheet that's half an inch thick cut, they're going to try to charge you $700 for it. So when the manufacturers of these things were able to get away with hiding the flaws so they wouldn't have to eat the cost, they did. And if it was okay and this thing hasn't exploded in the past 30 years, it's probably fine now. So depending on how hard your water is, you may need to clean up some hard water spots before you can put your new silicone in. You don't want the silicone going over carbonate deposits because then if they end up dissolving in your tank later, you'll end up with leaks. Now, there's a lot of ways that people do this. What a lot of people do is they'll just take a razor blade and some water and work at it. And that's a good idea for larger hard water deposits. You're going to save yourself a lot of grief if you just scrape it off first. After that, people go to a variety of options. The most common one that people generally use is vinegar. And I don't really like vinegar as an option just because of the smell. You know, when you've got a strong vinegar in a tank and you stick your head in there to scrub at something or wipe it off, it's just overwhelming. So my go-to for cleaning that kind of stuff up is CLR. I like this for a number of reasons. First, the ingredients aren't terribly dangerous and they wash out pretty easily. You do need to basically rinse the tank 5 or 6 times with a spray bottle and wipe it off to make sure that it's gone, but it's lactic acid and a couple other things that aren't really a big deal. The other reason that I really like this is, instead of smelling like vinegar and choking me, it smells like Spritz cookies. Now, you don't want to be, you know, breathing it in for fun, but at a 50% dilution, which is what I do, it's a pleasant smell to work with. It doesn't make the job unbearably bad. You can get away with something like muriatic acid, which I like to use as a last course thing. Once all of the silicone is back in and cured, I'll fill up the tank, I'll add this entire jar, and I'll let it sit for a day just to eat away at anything else that's in here, because it won't really bother the silicone with the amount that's in there. This is a very strong smell. If you think vinegar is bad, this is much, much worse. But it's pretty cheap, and if you're doing it outside and you're okay with making sure you don't get it on you, this works a lot faster than CLR does. It's about $5 for a quart of it. It's not super dangerous. You know, you'd think hydrochloric acid would be a big issue. You know, they call it muriatic because it's diluted. But it's not really a huge thing. If you get it on your hand or something, you know, you might end up with some white spots as it dries out. If you've got, oh god, the bottle leaks. It's really foul in odor. It's a lot worse than vinegar, but it does cut through stuff very quickly. What I like to do for cleaning the tank, I don't know if you can see the difference between this half here and the half behind me, but this half is basically crystal clear, and what I will do is I'll mix up a batch of 50% CLR, 50% water, and I will just wipe it on the glass very thickly, let it sit for about 20 minutes, wipe on another coat, let it sit for about another 20 minutes, and then just wipe it off. That's it. There's no scraping, there's no scrubbing, there's nothing else. It's a pretty easy cleanup. When you wipe it off the first time, it does have propylene glycol in it, which leaves a really weird film on the glass and makes it look a lot dirtier than it actually is. But that goes away after a couple of rinsings with water. This is my absolute favorite way to do this. For any areas that are really going to be visible, it's a good idea to go ahead and tape off the area so that you can get some nice clean edges and you won't end up with too much of a smudge. Any place else, it's really up to you. Most of the corners on this are covered up by the trim, so I'm not going to worry about it. It's just these front corners here that I'm really going to worry about. The black, or the back, I'm going to do in black. I'm going to paint the sides of the back black. You're not going to see it. The only place that it's going to be visible here is up here. So this is what I'm going to go ahead and do just to walk you through it in case you're not familiar with it already. Now, when you get silicone, you do want to open it at a bit of an angle so that you have a little bit more control over where things go. Hopefully that's focusing there. And most of the silicone caulking guns have a bar on them, and this bar is generally used for poking the membrane that's down inside of this. You do have to make sure that the hole that you cut is large enough to actually get it down there, but you want to make a couple holes because otherwise you're just going to be squeezing the handle and nothing will happen. Generally at this point you want to wear gloves. This stuff can be pretty gross. It gets on everything, so you want to be able to peel that off easily. It's also rather awful in odor. It produces a very, very strong vinegar odor, so you want to do it someplace where that's either not going to bother anybody or where you have good ventilation, because it can get strong enough that it causes some respiratory issues for some people. I'm just going to run a bead up your crack, come back in, smooth it in with a gloved finger. You'll end up with a really nice looking application that way, and once you're done, just give it a couple minutes, peel the tape off, be careful not to disturb it, and you're good to go. If you're going to tape the entire tank, go ahead and do the entire tank before you start pulling the tape off. And if you get any, down here on the glass, don't worry about it. Give it 24 hours to cure and you can scrape it off with your razor blade. So I pulled off the tape, and you can see this is just immediately after I applied it. You end up with some very nice, clean lines this way. As you do this, make sure you've got plenty of paper towels around, because you will end up with a lot of excess. When you come in here and you smooth it out, you will still end up with giant globs of excess that you have to get rid of. When you go to apply this, make sure that your cut is facing whatever corner you're in so that you have a little bit of room, and you really just need a pretty small amount. So elevate it just to see how much is actually coming out here. Pretty thin. Once your silicone's had a chance to cure overnight, you can come back in and clean up any mess pretty much instantly. When you spray paint glass, one of the things that you really need to be careful of is that you don't rush. You don't want to do a solid coat at once, or you're going to end up with a lot of drips and lines. You're just going to do a real rough coat, and then you're going to walk away. I know that might be hard to do, but you're just going to ignore it and walk the hell away for 10 minutes, then come back and do another coat. Otherwise, you can end up with runs, you can end up with spotting, you can end up with clear areas that you really have to come back and deal with. At the end of the day, when you think you've got it good, get yourself some kind of a light, and put the light inside so you can check for thin spots, because you don't want it having light spots later. You can see there's dark and there's thick areas, so I need to go over this one more time to really get a good film thickness on this. If you go slow, You'll get it all done over the course of a couple of hours, but you'll end up with a really nice flat surface. You won't end up with runs and bubbles and things like that frequently happen when you're trying to spray paint glass. Other things of high importance when you're spray painting anything, make sure you stay at least about 12 inches away. The instructions on your can are going to say 10 to 16 inches. A lot of people miss that, and they'll try to go, real up close to get a real solid coat, and that's where a lot of the running and gross paint that doesn't cure comes from. So make sure you stay at least 12 inches away, and make sure that you're doing this someplace that's well ventilated. Ideally, you want to do it outside. If you're not going to do it outside, make sure you've got a lot of open windows, some open doors, a lot of fans going, so that you're not going to end up with these fumes stuck inside with you breathing them constantly. If you find yourself needing to clean spots up, it's a good idea to do it while it's still a little bit gummy, before it's really had the hour or so that it takes to really dry well. You can see maybe right here there's like a hair or something stuck in it. So this is about 6 minutes after I did it. But it comes off very cleanly before it dries. So you're done painting, you're done siliconing. Now all you really need to do is leak test. This is really just a technicality if you've done this right. It's something that you want to do just in case there was a little bit of residue someplace that stopped some of the silicone from sticking. Just in case one of your seams is a little bit worse than you thought it was, and you need to find out if you need to pull the glass apart, but that's pretty unlikely. At this point, I'm going to let it run for about 24 hours. I've got this super old pump that came with this tank. I'm going to go ahead and run this with some muriatic acid in it. So I'm just going to add this entire thing of muriatic acid. You can see the vapors coming off of this, I think, in the video. This is an incredibly strong irritant for your lungs. So make sure you do this someplace that's well ventilated. I've got airflow coming through here, but it's still just hovering, so I've got to open a door. This should help clean off some of the residue on the front that wasn't cleanable before. One thing that's important to remember when you're cleaning these kinds of things is there's some things that just won't come off. Now, you can sit and repolish the entire surface of the glass if you want. That's not something that I find really worthwhile for doing in most cases, because they're not super noticeable and it doesn't really matter all that much as long as your glass isn't completely ruined. But, this area up here, the CLR didn't remove it. You can't really remove this kind of stuff with a brass wire brush that would be safe to use, because brass is about the same hardness as calcite or calcium carbonate that's in here. They're both about 3.5. So I've got here a steel wire brush. I don't know if you can tell or not, but those spots are still there. So a steel wire brush is not removing them. They're not coming off. At this point, this video is almost as long as it will take you to actually do this project. So I'm going to cut this off and move the rest of it for refurbishing the actual stand, fixing any of the wood issues that are happening with it, insulating the tank so that you save a little bit of money on electricity, those kinds of things, to a second video, so this doesn't end up being an hour-long thing. We'll see you guys then.